Good afternoon and welcome to the second appointment of the T20 Forum. I'm Giovanna Pancheri. I'm a journalist from Sky TG24. Sky TG24 is a media partner of this event with Corriere della Sera Economia. As you may know, we are going to talk today about social cohesion. The first forum has been focusing on climate change, and this time we're gonna, on the other hand, focus on a real issue, especially after this year of pandemic. You know, in the first months, we focused mainly on the health emergency, on the health crisis, but now everywhere in the world, we are trying to understand how to come out from the economic and social crisis that this pandemic brought with it. And we are going to have prominent guests today for 3 hours of conversation on several topics. But of course, we're going to start with the welcome address from ISPI and from Fondazione Cariplo that hosts actually the T20. So we are with Paolo Magri from Fondazione ISPI. From ISPI is the Executive Vice President and is also the National Coordinator and Chair of T20 in Italy, and Giovanni Fosti, which is the President of Fondazione Cariplo. Thank you for being with us today. So Paolo, if you want to start with your welcome address.
Thanks, Giovanna. It's a real pleasure to kick off this event that you just presented, which ISPI and Fondazione Cariplo have promoted in the framework of the G20 T20. I really wish to start thanking all the partners that made this possible and all the panelists which will be featured today, with a special thanks to Minister Orlando, which will conclude our summit together with Professor Tito Boeri, who is the lead co-chair of one of the task force. As you mentioned, Giovanna, today we will address one of the three P's of the Italian G20, people, planet and prosperity. And we will focus on the P of people in trying to understand what we can do together for the future of our people, for the future of the 130 millions of people who became new poor during the pandemic, for the future of the 33 millions who became new unemployed during the pandemic, and among them, as we all know, the most vulnerable, meaning women, young people, and low-skilled workers are the priority. Which policies are needed to create opportunities for all? How can government, civil society, the private sector work together? How can multilateral cooperation help? And what is the role of the Italian G20 in 2021? These are just a few of the questions at stake. And the challenge, Giovanna, the challenge is in answering to this question is to be at the same time humble and ambitious. Humble in looking for easy to implement solutions, ambitious in finding creative and innovative ideas. To be at the same time able to address short-term needs now, but at the same time keeping in mind the long term, not having short-term solution which prevents long-term growth and prosperity. And to be at the same time, this is our main focus, Giovanna, this year, to be at the same time focused on the G20 countries. We are the G20 at the end, but keeping in mind that what happens or does not happen in the other countries of the world, which are not part of the G20, is relevant, is very important. So let me conclude saying that Italy bears this year, in 2021, an important responsibility for the G20. We at ISPI, we are aware that we have to play our role as national coordinator and chair of the think tank community. We need to stimulate the think tank community to come up with new ideas, action-oriented ideas, policy-oriented solutions that can help the G20 process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. And of course, as you were saying, you know, the G20, especially right now, is even more important because we understood the past year how much a crisis could be global and so how much a solution must be global. Otherwise, you know, there is no a proper answer to the crisis that we have to face. And so, President Fosti, if you want to welcome us with your address.
Thank you, and buongiorno a tutti. It's a real pleasure for me to be here, and allow me to start by thanking ISPI for the extraordinary work they have been doing as coordinator and chair of this Italian edition of T20. And starting with the choice to put at the center of the debate some of the most pressing challenges that are being faced at global level, from climate change and its impact on people's well-being, to education, and of course, inequalities and social cohesion. Topics that have been long since at the core of Fondazione Caripl's work and of other philanthropic institutions like ours. I can say that the 86 Italian banking foundation have indeed allocated in 2019 around 900 million euros to support over 20,000 initiatives that are trying to contribute to the enhancement of social cohesion. Just two considerations. The first, I believe that from the very beginning of the pandemic and for some time after, a lot of energy has been put to think how can we go back to the past. And so we were looking at the future, thinking of the past. So the question was, how can we go back? Today, it is clear that we went through an extremely deep transformation, and that old maps and frameworks will not be very much of help to understand the world which is coming. So that's why we must be equipped not only with a rigorous knowledge, but also with a shared vision, shared goals, and clear ideas about what is important to achieve or change in the next future. And this is why debating arenas like T20 are important, and this year's agenda comes at the perfect time for this aim. The last consideration I'd like to share with you is that it is unarguable that the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities, and 1 year after the outbreak, the endurance of our communities is at risk. Because of the crisis, gaps within society are widening, and we are witnessing new forms of inequality and new forms of poverty. Some of them are already tangible, such as food poverty or energy poverty. Others are somehow less noticeable today, such as educational or digital poverty, but for sure they are relevant for the future. And all forms of inequality are generating social exclusion, and they undermine the sense of belonging to a society. Therefore, inequalities are a problem for the individual and are a problem for the community, and we must face this inequality as the first problem in our society. That's why I am very grateful, and I give my thanks to all of our panelists today that I'm sure will help us to bring into focus the complexity of today's topic and provide us as the leaders, they will provide the leaders of G20 with valuable insights and on what we should do in order to make sure that no one is left behind in this rebuilding journey. Thank you.
Thank you, President Fosti. And you know, you were quoting inequality in your address, and this is exactly what we're going to try to discuss about in the first panel about scenarios. And it's a pleasure for us to host here Professor Angus Deaton, who is a senior scholar at Princeton, but is also a Nobel Economic Prize laureate in 2015. And, you know, also taking into account what President Fosti was saying, I would like to ask to Professor Deaton how much, you know, poverty and other serious issues such as access to quality education and health service have been exacerbated by this pandemic? And, what is, in this behalf, the legacy that COVID-19 left to us? Professor Deaton.
So that's a really great question. I'm hoping that the legacy will not be too bad, but I think the big point to make here is that bad things have happened, especially to health and to education, as you mentioned. But if we don't take policy action, then those long-term effects could be very serious indeed. I think I'm particularly worried about education, where many kids, especially poorer kids, have had a very hard time with education during the pandemic. The richer kids in rich countries have, managed to be educated electronically and have lost very little, but I'm really worried about poorer kids in rich countries and poorer kids around the world. There's quite a lot of literature that shows that these educational deficits early in life are very, very hard to make up and may have long-term consequences. So we don't want to be left with a COVID generation that's not as well educated and perhaps not as healthy as it would otherwise be. So that means we've got to do something, and we need policies that actually build back, or to use the current phrase, build back better, by making sure that these deficits are eliminated and eliminated pretty soon. With health, I'm a bit less worried about long-term effects, though it's clear that in some places where the hospital system is overwhelmed, many people got sick or even died because they couldn't get regular medical help. The key message I want to get here, this is my last point, is countries have to be really careful to stay away from austerity. And that's going to be hard because the austerity hawks are out there. They're going to say, we have to pay for this pandemic. We spent a huge amount of money. And the way to get that money back is to cut services, which means health and education for relatively poor people. It would be a tragedy if poor people had to pay for the pandemic twice over.
And Professor, another tragedy, of course, is the impact of this pandemic on growth. What have been the effects of increasing inequality within and between countries during the pandemic? Could you please summarize for us your findings in this respect?
Well, I think I could spend almost every day, almost all day, answering that question. There's so much happening and so much to worry about. Just as a preliminary point, I don't think inequality always strangles economic growth. And in fact, I wrote a whole book, The Great Escape, which showed that in good times when there was a lot of innovation and when there was a lot of growth, that growth often brought with it inequality. But that's not what we're seeing now. And what I'm really worried about the most, I guess, in rich countries, especially the United States, is that with low interest rates, which are required for a sensible macroeconomic policy to help the recovery, the low interest rates have raised the price of assets. So the people who hold assets have done very, very well around the world in rich countries, especially in the United States. And that's been made even stronger by the fact that big tech has been so successful during the pandemic. And of course, that's a good thing. We needed Amazon, we needed Netflix, we needed Google, we needed Apple, who made the pandemic much more tolerable than it otherwise would have been. But when you look at the net effect, you've got millions of people around the world dying. In the United States, perhaps close to 1 million people now. At the same time as holders of wealth who are not dying in the same numbers at all, are making huge fortunes. And that is something that I think is extremely unfortunate, and I think something needs to be done about it. So in the United States, for example, people with a bachelor's degree own 74% of all assets, They're about a third of the population, but they were only responsible for about 15% of COVID deaths. So they were sheltered, they got rich. So this is a bit like a wartime situation in which in many countries in the First and Second World War, you needed the arms manufacturers, you needed the people making the material for war to go on running, and they would make enormous profits doing that while the ordinary working people were dying in the trenches. Governments dealt with that by having special one-time taxes on the arms manufacturers or on the people who were making the stuff that was needed to fight the war effort. I think we need to think about seriously about that in this context too. You asked about between countries too. I've been doing some work on that. It's a little complex because what happened, much contrary to what people expected, was that the rich countries suffered many more deaths per capita than did the poor countries. And that has meant that there's been a force towards greater equalization, not the other way around. But I wouldn't worry about that so much. What I really worry about is the poverty that's coming to the poor countries, because for them, a same decrease in GDP per capita and consumption has a much bigger effect on poverty. So that poverty is being unequally distributed around the world.
And Professor, you recently mentioned that health and education can be an antidote to the flaws of the current capitalist model. So in your view, how should policy be designed in order to build a fairer society where health and education services are available to all?
Well, it's very important that people have access to good education and to good health. I think everybody recognizes that. It's not clear to me that health is directly connected to healthcare. Healthcare is incredibly important, even if it doesn't go directly into health. So what every country needs, and what even the US lacks, is a universal healthcare system that enrolls people at birth, and it has to have price controls. And without price controls, this can take over your economy. And again, the US is the worst possible example of that. But education is itself very important for health. And in fact, if you look at what's been happening now, I suspect the educated people are protecting themselves relatively well during the pandemic, and we have some new results coming out on that. But when we think of health, don't always think of health services. And one of the big lessons of this pandemic is that public health systems didn't always respond very well, especially in some of the rich countries. Some countries like Britain and the US have actually done very well with vaccinations, but they did very poorly with terms of vector control or disease control early in the epidemic. So I think one of the things we're going to need to look at very seriously once this is died down is what went wrong, what sort of public health systems would prepare us for something else like this, because there's no guarantee that this won't happen again. And in fact, there's no guarantee that this is even done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Deaton. I just would like to remind you that, of course, all our panels and forum is broadcast live also on the T20 website and on the ISPI website. And now, Liv Frenssen should have joined us. I don't know if it's ready and available for us. Is a senior social and health policy advisor, former director in social affairs center for the European Commission. I'm just asking if he is with us. Mr. Frenssen?
Yes, I'm there.
Liv, Mrs. Frenssen?
I'm there.
Okay.
Do you hear
because
me?
I cannot see you. Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes.
Now I'm sure that I'm going to see you as well. So I just would like to ask you if public investment in social infrastructure, if we, Professor Deaton was talking about the importance of health and education, but at the same time, if we look in general, public investment on social infrastructure, they have reached a 20-year low even before the pandemic. You know that, Ms. Frenssen. So I would like to ask you, you know, now the situation is going to be even worse, of course, after this difficult year for everybody. Could you offer us a picture of the situation, starting from an European perspective when it comes to public investment on social infrastructure?
Okay, good afternoon. I hope, thanks for inviting me for this important event. I'm speaking to you from India, and I hope that the connection will stay stable, because we are here just past a cyclone that disrupted quite a lot of infrastructure, actually. So I just would like to draw a little bit of a picture, as you asked, for Europe first. One of the major consequences and the causes of the recession a decade ago was actually the fall in investment in general. More than 500 billion annually was not invested. And that dramatic decline affected both private and public investment. And in our report, we made a report, a high-level task force under the chairmanship of President Prodi, on long-term investment in social infrastructure. And we estimated that the public investment alone in the social infrastructure in the EU in 2015 was 170 billion per year. That seems a lot, but when we calculated the gap was 100 to 115 billion euro a year also. So that's a major gap that is probably not going to improve much now with the COVID epidemic. I just would like to clarify a little bit what we took under the social infrastructure. Social infrastructure, we took health, long-term care, affordable housing, education, and long life learning. That's in the definition we used, because there is no real official definition. We also recognize that the physical and non-physical infrastructure has become blurred, and that digitalization and other technical changes does not stop short of a social sectors. The smart infrastructure combines physical infrastructure with digital and connectivity. That is demonstrated very clearly now also with the COVID epidemic, how important that is also in social infrastructure. Now we took the initiative to make that call attention for the long-term investment because of the crisis, and now we're in a similar situation again. We mainly focus on short-term emergencies. But the social model's transformation require really long-term investment and a modernization. It needs also sustainability. We have an aging population. We have to be proud about the social infrastructure and social models in Europe, but it still needs adaptation. Austerity, unemployment, and now COVID have increased really drastically the gaps that exist. We also recognize something that was not sufficiently recognized by the EU institutions before, was that in Europe, local governments have a very critical role in those investments. And because the central governments squeezed the local governments and the European also squeezed the central governments, this came at the expense of investing in social infrastructure. One of the responses was the Juncker plan. The Juncker plan to increase the investments, but sadly, it only invested 3% of its assets of its funds to social infrastructure. Therefore, our report then became actually at the core of a new program, a new EU Invest program that included for the first time a social window. The social window for the moment has a 4 billion euro allocated, with the expectation that 50 billion euro of capital would be drawn into the investments. That leaves a major shortfall. But of course, this is not only the European institutions, but also the promotional banks. And later on, maybe I could say something about additional private sector. Now, since COVID showed very drastically how the lack of investment in social infrastructure and connectivity in Europe hampered to deal with the epidemic. Just and it increased poverty drastically, homelessness, and inequality. Countries like Germany had double the number of ICU beds than Italy when the crisis started. Homelessness has increased with, I mean, I'm not going to give numbers here, but it's increased drastically also. And then very painfully, we saw how the neglect of senior homes and care for senior citizens has caused a lot of unnecessarily pain and death with COVID. So,
indeed, and you know, you were talking about this huge gap that you were funding when you were the chair of the EU high-level task force on investing on social infrastructure in Europe. It was 1.5 trillion until 2020 of a gap, you know, when it comes to investments. At the same time, so you were saying now how much the pandemic make the situation even worse. So if you could tell us what type of investment we should prioritize right now, what would you say?
The prioritization of the investment should be, I think the easiest and the fastest could be the housing, energy efficient, affordable housing. Then what is really necessary across all of Europe is long-term care, mainly for disabled and senior citizens. And then I would also say telehealth has taken a boost with COVID and tele-education, but it also increased the disparity and the inequality because people that have not had the access to tele-education, like here in India, for example, there's a year that schools have been closed. That means a major impact on human capital in the future that will not be corrected very easily. So that's, for me, the important priorities. But you highlight also the fact that can we fill that gap of the 1.5 trillion that we calculated until 2030? And I think we should, and it would be possible if there's a political will and a focus and partnerships. And I think the G20 has therefore a very important role and an opportunity here to make that happen. I told you a little bit already about the promotion, the instruments of the EU and the funds of the EU, but there's also, of course, promotional banks. In Italy, we have Casa, and we have major promotional banks in most of the countries that are now working together also with the EU institutions. But we should not forget also, we have and we should get more private investments. Private investments are critical. And therefore, we need to really attract huge stock of long-term savings. The savings are there, and they should be used to invest in long-term and look at the right risk and yield profile. A new asset class for social infrastructure should be created globally, and Europe should really harvest the largest quota of private savings to channel to what social investments needs. And I hope that will be one of the responses to the COVID epidemic also. Partnerships are very important to get the right projects, because investors very often say there is no pipeline of sound projects, and development financing is needed. And development financing, I mean, is not only long-term investments, but also investment with technical assistance to borrowers so that they can learn to evaluate the returns, assess the opportunities, and get the right policies in place. We need new instruments such as social bonds and social impact investments. They start being created, but not fast enough and not at a large scale enough. And then the investors, the private investors need to learn to work on social investment, social infrastructure investment, because traditionally the projects are smaller, 100 to 200 million euro. The cash flow is provided mostly and predictability by the public sector in a long term. Impact assessments at environmental, social, and economic are not necessarily done very easily by the public sector yet. and then the revenues, how to create the revenues and how to assess the revenues. Also, for example, with tax revenues after 5, 10 to 20 years is not a simple thing to do yet, and is not included not necessarily in this. But so for me, in summary, it is possible, it should be possible, it's a lifetime opportunity for Europe to upgrade the social infrastructure backbone and modernize our social models. It's an economic opportunity and it's a political necessity.
So, but you're talking to us from India, you were saying before, no? You're broadcasting from India. And at the very beginning of our conversation, we were saying how much this pandemic, opened eyes about the fact that when you have a global crisis, you need a global solution. So we just talk about the necessity to do more when it comes to social investment in the EU. But, the EU, it's quite advanced when it comes to social investment compared to developing countries. So what we should do actually to, to try to start to invest also in social asset in developing country, according to you?
Yeah, well, I'm talking to you from India, where the COVID, in the middle of the crisis of the COVID, the worst COVID epidemic and the worst peaks worldwide. And there's just also been a cyclone passing by here that has destroyed a lot of the already precarious social infrastructure and connectivity infrastructure. So I was afraid that my connection would not be as stable as I would like it to be. But that's true for so many other people in a much more serious situation. So this shows. I mean, the situation in the developing world is, of course, multiplied. Scale is, and the urgency is even much bigger. And I hope, therefore, that the G20, having a larger group of countries that are concerned and engaged in this discussion, will and engaged in this mobilization, will really make a change here, because we see the impact here of COVID, about climate change, cyclones, and so in a real important, dramatic. People are dying not only from COVID, they're dying from lack of oxygen, but also lack of food and livelihoods. People here where there is no social security like we have in Europe. So people that have no job from one day to another go hunger. For the moment, the cyclone has destroyed 200 houses around where I am here, much worse, and it's killed people. So it shows very much how the infrastructure in general and social infrastructure really needs to be boosted very quickly. And this is, for me, also an opportunity for the whole world to work together to make this happen. Again, the development funds have decreased recently and have never focused sufficiently on social infrastructure. There's always been a strange dilemma between should we focus on social services or social infrastructure. Both go together, of course. I see here the doctors that want to help. There's no hospitals, there's no oxygen, there is no telemedicine. Most of the rural areas don't have doctors, actually. So we're trying to set up tele support here for the moment, where it's most needed in rural areas. We need to again mobilize much more private capital. The private investors have not had the same exposure in less developed countries. So again, it's a learning process, but together we could make that happen, and that would really make a win-win situation for the whole world. The public sector, in my opinion, will remain a dominant source for funding, but also for policy and priority setting. It will be limited in its funding because the finances are already very stretched, and with COVID, there will be even more stretched, less growth, like our first professor mentioned, and that is very worrying for the whole world, actually. So I think good facilities for education, health, housing, connectivity are essential for people, and they are essential for political systems also here. The G20 therefore has a critical role, and I hope it's not just the infrastructure, but it's people's life, people's human capital, social capital that is as a result of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Liv Franzen. And, you know, as you were mentioning, also development funds has been cutting all over, you know, after this difficult year, but also in general, even private aid to developing countries reduced, maybe because solidarity is not anymore after this year so important and so big as it used to be. And that's going to bring us to our last guest of this panel, Professor Mauro Magatti, which is Professor of Sociology at the Catholic University of Milan, but is also member of the steering board of Fondazione Cariplo. So, Professor Magatti, good afternoon to you. As we were mentioning with Liv Franzen, you know, in a recent publication, you actually argued that COVID-19 has not made us better people because the pandemic has eroded the dimension of social solidarity. What are the health conditions, let's say, of social cohesion, and how worried should we be about the consequences?
Yes, thank you for inviting me. Of course, the questions you put to me is very difficult to say. Let me start saying that in the last 18 months during the pandemic, our societies have been subjected to a contradictory dynamic. The global virus has blocked the economic growth and induced a severe recession. We are waiting for a rebound in the second part of this year. But uncertainty will remain high and unevenly distributed. The shock has produced asymmetrical effects among groups, sectors, territories, and as a matter of fact, inequality has sharply increased both within and between countries. At the same time, COVID has accelerated technological and cultural transformation. Prospect for the economic revival incorporate sustainability and digitalization. This can be promising under many aspects, but it would be wrong not to consider that these two drivers risk aggravating social inequalities. It's by no means certain that sustainability and digitalization will heal social wounds. On the contrary, at least in the short-medium period, they might exacerbate existing social tension while offering new opportunities only for the best equipped groups, territories, and countries. Moreover, the entropic implications of the economic growth are far from being solved. The fact is that after the pandemic, we can no longer avoid rethinking the question of risk. Unlike what has been thought in the decades of expansive globalization, when risk exposure was undervalued and passed on to the individuals, we have now to recognize that there are not only individuals, but also collective risks. After the third global shock in 19 years, 9/11 involving the relationship between cultures and religions, and the 2008 financial crisis touching the link between financialization and consumerism, and now the pandemic, the side effects of economic growth cannot be ignored any longer.
And, you know, people tend to blame government, you know, for the economic and social problem. But it's also clear that in today's world, it's not possible to actually rely exclusively on the public sector. How can a better and more effective social model based on everyone's responsibilities be established?
Sorry, I lost the connection, so I cannot answer to you.
No,
I lost the connection.
Can you hear me now?
I was still thinking.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you.
I was just asking you, you know, you were saying also about this problem of solidarity, of social solidarity that has not been there, how much we will hope during this pandemic. But at the same time, when we look the economic situation, people tend to blame government, to their economic and social problems. But of course, we cannot rely exclusively on the public sector to solve our problem. And so I was asking you how we can establish a more, let's say, effective social model, which is based on everyone's responsibilities, not just, what the government can do for me, let's say, to quote someone very famous, but what we can do, to have a better and effective social model.
Well, of course, this has to do with the role of civil society, of the third sector, as we call it in Italy, and the role that single people may play in building social solidarity. It's very difficult to understand whether the pandemic may result in development of social solidarity, or on the contrary, it may develop a very conflictual setting. Let's say that, as Ms. Frenzen was saying, it's important to develop new social infrastructure, which may put the active role of people in positive terms. This means not just investing in education, which is essential because solidarity is a byproduct of education, basically. But at the same time, it's very important to mobilize new financial resources. I strongly agree with the statement saying that we need state finances, but we need to move private investment towards social infrastructure. And the third element, the role of the private sector and the role of the third sector is contemporary, very important, because we have to leave a pure individualized idea of social welfare towards a more contributive idea, where being citizen means to be part of a strong society, because there is no economic growth without a strong society.
So, talking about that, your last book, you argue that in the end there is a new beginning. So there is hope, Professor Magatti, let's say, and how we can actually, according to you, turn the tragedy of this pandemic into a real opportunity to rebuild our society around the idea of solidarity.
The pandemic taught us that no one is independent from the other. That is, we are interdependent. That is, we are closely linked each other, and the hope to save yourself without any interest to other people, it makes no sense. So this is very important, because we come from decades where we thought that society is made simply by the sum of millions of individuals. You may remember the expression of Mrs. Thatcher that there is no such a kind we call society, there are just individuals. This is completely wrong. There are individuals and there are societies, and the virus taught that this is absolutely true. This idea of interdependency is very important to rebuild our social welfare.
Thank you very much, Professor Magatti, also for giving us, a little bit, a glimpse of hope at the end, a kind of possibility that we can use to take something good from this difficult year. Now we're going to move to our next panel, which is going to focus on the national dimension of social cohesion. We're going to have as well distinguished guests also for this panel. We're going to start with Professor Raghuram Rajan, which is Professor of Finance at the Chicago Booth School of Business. And I would like to start asking Professor Rajan, the pandemic showed us that the existing model of social and institutional organization are no longer appropriate. How would you describe today's situation on this behalf?
So the pandemic has been obviously an enormous shock to the global economy, but it's affected us at every level. If you think, certainly at the local community level, there has been a very differential impact across communities in the United States. For example, minority communities, African American communities have been affected much more than traditionally white communities, but also different groups have been affected more. The working person who has to go out to the factory or to the shop floor has been affected much more than the high quality service person who can stay at home and do their job online. So differential impact at the individual and local level, differential impact across countries. We've had some countries which have been brutally affected by the pandemic, certainly the United States, but also Brazil, India now, and many smaller, less developed countries, a huge impact on them. Not only has the virus hit them harder because their medical facilities are more modest, but also the economic impact has been more because they haven't been able to offer support, fiscal support to their households and their firms. And of course, globally, we're seeing a lack of global sort of togetherness on this issue. We have less than desirable collective action. You can see it in the the reluctance or the reluctance of countries to allow, for example, exports of vaccines and vaccine-related products, but also the fact that some countries are going to be fully vaccinated this year, while many countries may wait for 2 or 3 years more to get fully vaccinated. So there is a inequality amongst countries also, some of which could have been remedied by collective action. Nobody is saying you should wait for your population to get vaccinated, but perhaps collective action could have made it easier for others to get vaccinated quickly. So we need action on all dimensions, local, national, global. And how do we sort of rethink the governance of the global economy, the local economy, and the national economy in a way that this action becomes more feasible? This is something that we have to do at every level, and I hope we do that.
But indeed, Professor Rajan, as you wrote in your book, The Third Pillar, a new balance between the market and the state that involves also the community must be reached. But actually, how we can do that?
Right, that's a wonderful question to ask at this time. As I just said, we need to rethink how governance should work at every level. In some countries, there has been too much centralization. And as a result, what we've had is national lockdowns, which have been of great severity, but in some places weren't needed and have affected local activity. Sometimes the amount of national activity has displaced potential local activity. And similarly, what we've seen is there's been a lot of national focus, but very little international cooperation on this. So effectively, we have to start thinking about how we change. And often the answer has to be based on what is known as the principle of subsidiarity. Let's push activity down to the lowest level that is capable of taking it. And given that, sometimes certain actions, for example, arranging a national vaccine, might have to be taken at the national level, but decentralizing the process of rolling it out to the local level, because the local level knows which are the populations, which are the groups in greatest danger and have to be vaccinated first. That might be a way of doing it, but we need to extend this, not just to vaccines, not just to what is happening on the pandemic front, but to every level, because we have already seen some of the frustration with the existing system of governance. One of the concerns we have to keep in mind is in the reaction to the pandemic, we've again had a lot of centralization. For example, in the United States, we have massive federal programs being rolled out. In Europe, we've had much more activity at the European Union level, which wasn't there before, especially funding from the European Union level. Now, as we go beyond the pandemic, we have to make sure that this doesn't naturally create a concentration of power in the wrong places, which then creates a reaction over time. If there's too much centralization of power, there is a frustration at the local level. We don't have our own agency. We don't have the ability to determine our future, and that becomes problematic going on. So we have to certainly react quickly when there's a need, as there has been a need during the pandemic, but once it's over, re-examine to see whether power is in the right place.
You know, talking about that, Professor, actually you strongly believe in the power of free market and capitalism, without, of course, denying, as you were just saying, the problem in this and the need for a reform. But looking forward, how actually could financial and fiscal policy be reshaped and readapt in order to preserve social cohesion and also to empower the communities?
It's a great question. I think the problem to some extent of the frustration with markets, and certainly the frustration with global markets, is that they leave us feeling disempowered. In the interests of markets, actions are taken. For example, you must all follow common rules because the market demands it. You have no ability to determine the rules for your country or for your locality because we need the national market or the global market to work. So, for example, in many developing countries, they have no ability to determine how long they respect patent rights. And in the midst of the pandemic, they're forced to respect certain patent rights, even though sometimes, perhaps by shortening the patent rights, they can actually bring more medicines, more vaccines to their people. So, I mean, these are examples where there is a sense of frustration. The global economy, the global market, and the rules and regulations are holding us back. I think that as we go forward, we certainly have to think of, as I said before, what the right level of governance is, but also how much flexibility the local should have. Because the closer you are to where the rules are determined as a citizen, as an individual, the more empowered you feel, and therefore the more willing you are to tolerate fluctuations from the market, because you know that you have some ability to react if it is adversely impacting your community. So I would say that we certainly post-pandemic need to think about a decentralization of the rules that are able to be decentralized, but also to some extent a decentralization of funding. The wonderful fact of technological progress is we can do all this while maintaining some extent of local monitoring of the usage of funds, as well as national monitoring of the usage of funds using information technology. So one of the big worries about decentralizing funding was the local body will be corrupt, will be incompetent, will misspend it. But if you have local monitoring because the beneficiaries are seeing how it's spent, and you have national monitoring, light monitoring to see that in fact it's been spent reasonably, you have two-sided monitoring which can actually lead to much more effective spending. So I think we need to think again and again about how we can use new technologies to improve governance in such a way that people are empowered. That to me is the change that the pandemic allows.
Thank you very much, Professor Rajan. And now Adriana Sukova should join us. She's the Deputy Director General of Social Affairs, Employment and Inclusion at the European Commission. I hope she's here and she can hear me properly. Ms. Sukova, thank you for joining us. Good afternoon. So let's start about the effects of the pandemic in the EU social fabric in the different member states. Of course, you know, each of us, not just in Italy, we can see the results of this pandemic when it comes to social policy and economic situation. So what is the situation actually right now at the EU level, and how you know, short-term policy measures as the SURE program and mechanism can actually be effective in avoiding this economic and social fragmentation between the EU member states?
Well, I'm very happy to be able to join the discussion today. And you're right that the COVID pandemic created an unprecedented shock on our economies, on our societies. And I can say that the immediate reactions and responses at national and EU level were very bold and swift. You mentioned the SURE program, but I want to say that this is only one element of the reaction that was and action that was undertaken right after the pandemic broke out, and we had to totally change our way of working and living. First, we have seen a very widespread of the use and application of short-time work schemes for companies and industries and sectors that had to limit their activities. And at the same time, the workers who are involved in these sectors should protect their income, should continue thinking about the future where they can go back to a typical or atypical normal situation. And that's why we were so much eager to help member states and industries and sectors preserve the jobs, preserve the employment, and also make sure that the prospects for people are kept there. It is not only the SURE, it is also that the European Commission activated the suspension clause for the Stability and Growth Pact. So there are some relaxation of the rules and requirements on the macroeconomic stability for the member states, taking into account the difficult economic situation for all member states practically. None of them is spared. We also introduced a maximum flexibility for the use of the structural funds, because you know that there is a substantial amount of European budget which is spent through structural funds. And since last year was the last of programming for the previous programming period, there were limited resources that were programmed for activities not directly linked to the pandemic response. So the Commission adopted the flexibilization instruments like the Coronavirus Response Investment Initiative, allowing for member states to swiftly and quickly take use of any budget which is not yet programmed to operations or contracted, to be reoriented towards the immediate necessary actions. We also have this instrument and the SURE instrument, which was providing a very important financial support to member states to support the short-time work schemes and avoid the reduction of employment. With the Coronavirus Response Investment Initiatives, we also allowed 100% co-financing, so no national budget was needed to co-finance the operations linked to immediate responses, providing personal protective equipment or ensuring access to healthcare for everyone, and also making sure that this is an immediate and to short-term reaction and response to the pandemic, while we were working also on the thinking and proposing the measures within the REACT-EU new instrument, budgetary instrument, which gives additional funding to the current operational programs and also allows them to direct these additional resources towards employment support or social inclusion measures or providing access to healthcare, but also supporting self-employed, because usually we're talking about preserving jobs at company level for employees, but self-employed also a very important part of our economy, and they have also benefited from this type of support. I think that with the one very important lesson that we learned from the current pandemic is that we need to upskill and reskill everybody. It is the workers who need to be upskilled for working online, but also have all the equipment that they need. It's also for students and pupils who had to stay home but still attend school lessons, and they had to have the necessary equipment, but also the skills. And also, we think that we are supporting very strongly now with the REACT-EU investments, the reorientation of workers who are likely to lose their jobs towards possibilities of preparing them for new jobs, taking the time now that is in any way available to providing a direct support and assistance to workers that will be affected by the pandemic, or their businesses and occupations will be affected, to guide them towards forthcoming new sectors and new employment opportunities. So I think that the fact that the SURE has already spent almost 95 billion euro for member states' actions is one first level of demonstration of EU solidarity, and also a very direct support to people that are in very difficult situations. But also the fact of this amount of money is helping almost 30 million people in Europe. And this is a very, how to say, important or key for the survival of these people in Europe. And this is almost 25% of the workforce of those 19 member states who have used the SURE funding possibilities so far. So it is the immediate measures that the Commission took last year are really an instrumental element for alleviating or reducing and mitigating the negative impacts on people.
But indeed, you know, employment and smart growth, social and territorial cohesion are also part or pillars of the next generation EU. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on how these priorities will be pursued from now until 2026?
Well, the time frame of 2026 is indeed the period for spending of the next generation EU funding possibility of the European budget, which is an additional budget for the next years. And it will continue to have one main component. This is the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which was prepared last year as a first response for solving the current issues, both for economic, for territorial and social development, and also endowing this instrument with an incredible amount of money, never seen before. We have 312 billion euro, which will be distributed to member states through grants, and we have 360 billion more to be distributed as loans for reforms and investments which are related to the adjustment of our economies due to the pandemic. The spending of these 650 billion euro in the next 6 years is very closely linked to all the challenges that we are facing globally, not only in Europe. And they're linked to the greening of our economy and also of changing and taking our economy forward on a digital base. So at least 37% of the RRF Recovery and Resilience Facility budget should be directed towards measures and operations that are greening the economy or supporting our climate objectives. At least 20% should be directed to investments and reforms for the digital transition and the smart growth of our economies. In the social area, I have to underline that we have the European Pillar of Social Rights as a main framework for action. And also, beginning of March, the Commission adopted an action plan with a number of initiatives that have to be taking forward the implementation of the principles and rights of the European Pillar of Social Rights. It's linked to the modernization of labor market institutions, or to the promotion and upskilling and reskilling of our workforce, reinforcing the social protection and also the health systems. And also this will be part of the investments and reforms, not only within the Recovery and Resilience Facility, but also within the multi-annual financial framework, creating or supporting financially the cohesion policy funds.
But indeed,
yes.
No, if I may, Mrs. Sukava, because of course we have a lot of things to talk about it, and and we need to be a little bit strict when it comes to timing. But I have another question for you, because it's still common to think about the EU as a kind of aggregation of different states. But how can we move beyond this view? And according to you, welfare policy can actually help in this behalf.
It is true that there is limited possibility of EU-level action in the area of social policy. And this is enshrined in the treaty, so we have limited instruments with which we can encourage or guide member states towards the same direction. But there are EU-level actions, EU-level decisions that have been jointly undertaken, and these are the decisions, for example, on the European Pillar of Social Rights, or 10 days ago, the adoption of new headline targets towards 2030 in the area of employment, in the area of skills provision, and in the area of limiting poverty in the European Union. So the fact that we have a lot of subsidiarity to be watched for when we implement social policy in the European Union doesn't mean that we are disregarding the need to get closer to converge our levels of social development and also harmonize our systems and our approaches. And this is really one of the reasons or the basis for the European Union issuing a lot of recommendations and directives and not having the power to issue regulations which have direct power for the legal implementation in member states. But we are doing this in a very close cooperation and coordination with member states, because the single labor market of the European Union has an impact on everybody's life. We have free movement of people. We are encouraging and we are supporting the cross-border mobilities or people looking for jobs in another member state. So this was one of the bases for creating the European Pillar of Social Rights, where all member states and governments agreed to pursue the same principles and the same rights for their citizens and workers. And I want to just signal that the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated or sharpened our attention to some of these potential problems when a country is relying on cross-border workers for some sectors, and the pandemic limited the possibilities of people to travel daily. So at one point last year, there was a very critical situation in some member states who are relying on cross-border workers for a number of sectors, including the healthcare sector. So this means that we have to have first the legal possibility to ensure that the rights of persons are protected no matter where they live and work, but also ensuring that whatever rights they accrue in one member state, they can carry over throughout their career, and then can benefit from the social protection upon retirement, accruing all the rights throughout their lifetime of employment. So we have a number of key forthcoming initiatives to get closer our social protection systems, but closer in terms of mutual operational possibilities, not that much having one and the same model, because we want to keep the specificities, the national characteristics, and the traditions of different member states, because that's one of the richness of Europe.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Director General Sukova, for being with us. And now we're going to move to our panel discussion, and I would like to welcome our guest for that, Professor Murray Lebrand, which is Professor of Economics here at the University of Cape Town. And then we're going to be with Roberto Rossini, who is the spokesman for Alliance Against Poverty, Alejandra Cardini, Director of Education of the CIPPEC, and we're going to also be with Claudia Fiaschi, which is the spokeswoman for the Forum Terzo Settore. I think they should be all with us. So I'm going to start with Professor Lebrand. Good afternoon, Professor. We were talking a lot in our first panel about inequality, and especially how much also this pandemic brought to an increasing gap between the richest and the poorest in the world. So what are the main implications when it comes to government policy of this growing inequality?
Yes, well, of course, the concern over increasing poverty and inequality preceded the pandemic. Globally, there's been this concern, and the reason for the concern is because societies are getting low returns from any increment of economic growth. It doesn't feed down to its citizens. It isn't inclusive, to use the language of this discussion. And to understand that, you need to understand how the societies are working, the texture of that society, what the citizens can bring into the labor market. So that's why there's this concern about inequality. And then, as you said, the pandemic has sharpened that. It's sharpened the inequalities. It's sharpened the sense that societies with high inequalities underperform as societies. They don't leverage what their citizens have to offer. And so then, obviously, when the pandemic arrived, people then, there was a need for emergency responses. And those emergency responses pushed forward or accelerated discussions that were going on anyway about making more sustainable societies and more inclusive growth. So there was temporary relief measures that were put in place on the social expenditure side. So sometimes there'd been huge debates about a basic income grant, but with COVID, many countries just pushed forward and started implementing something as an emergency relief measure, or filled their social security gap. Obviously, what the COVID pandemic also accelerated was this discussion around the interface of more vulnerable workers that are in and out of the labor market and what sort of support for them, because the pandemic led to mass temporary unemployment as we did lockdown, etc. And so those systems around the labor market and appropriate systems where the old systems of unemployment benefits were just not working anymore were also accelerated. And they've stayed with us now. In a sense, they pushed us into the discussion about, okay, what is the future social security system in the world that we have? And one of the key learnings, I think, is that that you need to look both at social protection systems as well as these labor market systems and the intersections of them all. I think it's accelerated that discussion greatly. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lebrant. I'm going to be with you later again. So with Mr. Rossini, should I join us? Because, you know, when it comes to inequality and poverty, sometimes people start to think just about developing countries, but it's not the case. We have seen how much also developed economies are suffering for the incidence of poverty. And this used to be actually a serious problem even before the pandemic. What is the situation today, and why are so many individuals and households at risk of being marginalized and fall into poverty, even in developed economies?
Good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me. Yes, according to the Italian Statistical Institute data of March 2021, and last year, the current situation foresees an increase of about 1 million new poor people. Currently, there are 5.5 million absolute poor in Italy who are not able to satisfy their basic needs. And who are these poor people? In addition to the tragic confirmation of the usual Italian poverty framework, for example, large families, foreigners, people with low educational qualification, and people living in southern regions of the country, nowadays we realize that even the northern regions and working people are in trouble. On the other hand, if we think about seasonal workers, VAT workers, workers with weak employment contracts but without state benefits, we can understand everything and immediately. The poverty virus has affected earning vaccinated categories, equipped with the socioeconomic antibodies resistant, up to now immunized. In terms of social policy, at least two questions should be asked. Have the implemented government measures been effective? How to reduce these dramatic numbers? Pandemics have often had a leveling effect on the socioeconomic level, but not on COVID-19, which has operated on the contrary by widening existing inequalities. Therefore, if certain government measures had not been adopted, such as the block of layoffs, providences for fired workers or self-employed, citizenship income or emergency income, we would not only have 1 million more poor people, but almost 3.
Thank you. Thank you, Rossini. And, talking about consequence of this pandemic that actually affect not just the developing world, but also the developed world, I would like to ask to Ms. Alejandra Cardini, about the impact on school and education of this pandemic. We have seen severe disruption. Of course, digitalization has provided a partial solution to this issue, but students that come from financially fragile households are at a higher risk of being pushed out, actually, of the education system. We have seen that in Italy in a major way. Could you please briefly explain the situation that we are facing right now?
Yes, good morning to everyone. Thank you. This is a very important question. Today, we are facing a global education emergency with no precedents. COVID-19 has caused the biggest education disruption in modern history. So in the peak of the pandemic in April 2020, 90% of the students in 190 countries of the world were in their homes due to school closures. And that situation, although it is different today, UNESCO is estimating that more than 800 million learners, and that is half of the world's student population, are still affected by school closures. Today, 29 countries have full closures, and this education disruption, which is still ongoing in many countries, particularly in the global south, has terrible immediate and long-term effects on welfare, on learning, on earnings, and on life opportunities. And the key is that these effects are not equal for everyone. These inequalities that come from this education disruption are very visible and very different at individual level, within and across countries, and also in regional levels. So global education policy must address these different types of inequalities. At individual level, we know inequalities compound on those in emergency and conflict zones, as well as those facing those hardcore exclusion factors such as gender, race, language, and disability. In terms of regions, just let me give you an example of the region where I come from, where the pandemic in Brazil and Argentina is especially complex at the moment in terms of health responses. While last year in Latin America, children lost 150 days, in other regions as Western Europe, they only lost 50 days. So that is the gap between what education disruption meant. And another point I want to address, because I think it's very, very important, is learning losses. Evidence indicates that learning losses will disproportionately affect children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, marginalized groups, and less educated homes. And this comes, as we were mentioning for other areas as poverty, from severe pre-existing learning crises and difficulties to learn. So in this critical context, I think that attacking inequalities should be our priority, should be our obsession today.
Thank you, Director Cardini. So we're gonna go to Claudia Firaschi, which is the spokeswoman for the Forum for Terzo Settore. And, you know, we have seen during this pandemic, we were discussing that before with some previous guests about how much funds for your sector, for il terzo settore, let's say for the non-profit sector, has been reduced during this year of the pandemic. But at the same time, this sector has been mainly important, you know, to face several challenges when it comes to social and economic needs. Can you tell us a little bit what has been the role of the non-profit tech sector on trying to actually address this emergency during the pandemic?
Sì, intanto grazie per questo invito.
Thank you for inviting me here. The role of the non-profit sector, third sector, has been key because it proved to be a social infrastructure within communities, supporting people and also supporting communities, and something we can't do without. First, because it's not what it does, namely the ability to take action on the requirements of the community. It's a way of being citizens within one's own country or community. And so to work through participation of citizens, not just that, and not just, the delegation to the government for initiatives, but, getting down to it and finding solutions. In this case, pandemics, of course, has created an unprecedented social crisis because become, fragile people have become more fragile, and there have been a growing requirement of social needs and requirements, of course, and of course people felt lonely and they were isolated more than usual, and this also created a block on, the support in general. There were no funds, and also, voluntary organizations could not do what they were used to doing. And the third sector, the non-profit sector, carried on and adjusted to the situation. We learned how to learn, being, provided with protection devices, and also use all the tools and instruments that it's got to deal with also the occupational crisis, namely because we have in Italy 850,000 in Italy working in this sector, and we converted our activities, our resources, and developed, and also we became innovative, and we found new ways to be close to people by using technologies and creating important alliances between the various people in the community and entities, and this has become a strong support network. This in Italy has proved very important for the various areas and regions, especially the more fragile ones, the weaker ones, because there were skills already there, ready to be used so as to cope with this unprecedented health emergency, as we've seen.
Thank you. I would like to go back to Professor Lebrant because, to try actually also listening to all the different speeches that we had today, to try to tackle the problem of inequality, it's obvious that we need resources. So what is the possible role of taxation in mitigating the effect of increased inequality and leading to a fairer income redistribution? Also thinking about the recent proposal made by the US and the IMF, even the EU recently proposed a new system of taxation for the big corporation. So, if you can give us your assessment of what could be done when it comes to taxation.
Yes, so thank you. And I was remiss in not saying what a pleasure it is to be part of this panel discussion. Thank you very much. And so I'll get back to the specifics about the taxation of corporations at the end of my thoughts. But it's important to note that even from the IMF, from the International Monetary Fund, in the developing country context, preceding the pandemic, there was the beginnings of a recognition that the old orthodoxy that you don't need to worry about inequality or marginalization of sections of your population, and that there wasn't much you could do about it anyway, that was gone. And the last decade has witnessed a recognition and much more openness to the fact that you do have to confront your inequalities. And certainly work coming out of the IMF has documented the fact that there's scope for policy to actually crowd in, if you like, the activities of your citizens and to generally improve societies by actually acting against your inequality, by redistribution, in other words. So there's much more acceptance of redistributionist types of economic policies in order for societies to be more sustainable. But then obviously, so COVID has set upon us, and there are and it's led to real fiscal issues. We've had to respond. It's led to situations whereby the old metrics, many countries are actually in some sort of fiscal crisis. They've got some problems. So there's this disjuncture. There's this realization that you actually can act and you need to act to be more redistributive in your society, to shape your society to be more inclusive. At the same time, by the old metrics, societies are under pressure. So that puts the tax system into sharp focus because we need to raise revenue. We're spending a lot more, and we needed to, and nobody denies that. And as Angus Deaton said at the beginning, we need to stay away from austerity. That was what he said. We can't, it would be a tragedy if poor people have to pay for the pandemic. Well, poor people have been paying for the growth path as well. So it is, he's correct, but it's not so easy. And we do need to think about the tax side of the system as well. And so which taxes? What are we going to do? So in a society like I live in, I come from South Africa, it's an extremely high inequality country. And it's a country with a history of generating that inequality in a very unfair way. And so obviously taxes like wealth taxes come into sharp relief because we know that how inequality persists is that better off people have access to wealth and assets and can leverage better education and better health systems and therefore are better placed in the labor market, and inequality persists like that, whereas the poor don't have that. And so a targeted tax would be a wealth tax. But obviously the very fact that you're a very unequal society makes the tax base very thin. So your inequality itself is hugely problematic. You've generated an unsustainable society and your tax policy has to work with that society. So it's a real problem. And you've got to be very creative. And so it's appropriate, completely appropriate that wealth taxes are back on the agenda because it's part of the reason why we're in the situation we're in. In South Africa, for example, and there's lots of international lessons, like around inheritance taxes. Many countries around the world have very high inheritance taxes, and they don't question that. That's part of the fabric of their society. In South Africa, we don't, and it doesn't make sense. So there's a margin that we can work on. But longer run, the tax system is embedded in your society, and so we've got a very thin middle class. You need a class of taxpayers to make the system work. And so you've got to have a longer run vision within which you embed your tax policies. Coming back then to corporate taxes, the work that's been done in the US and from the IMF is very innovative because it deals with the world that we actually have rather than an economic textbook. If the structure of your economy and your companies is very concentrated, very large companies, then it's no use applying theories that are about a very competitive economy, because that's failing your people. If they live in a society where they get employed by these sorts of companies, and that's the companies you work with in terms of the tax discussion, and it opens up some options for company tax too as part of the system. So it's a time to be very innovative, where I think that the world milieu, the IMF, but maybe not the ratings agencies, are allowing countries to be a bit more creative. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lebrun. This is when it comes to taxation, but when it comes to policy, Mr. Rossini, that should be still with us, what policy would you think about to strengthen social cohesion in the medium term? How can, for example, universal basic income models be enhanced in order to be more effective and create, let's say, a virtuous cycles leading to more stable social and labor market inclusion?
Yes, I think that the best pattern may be the triangulation among stock, flow, and buffer. With the term stock, we mean the investment in human capital, in lifelong learning, to support socioeconomic development through more skilled and qualified jobs, to avoid entrapment in forms of unskilled job, as a strategic reversal from early childhood, to prevent rather than cure. The second term, flow, means supporting transition between labor markets, because markets are more unstable. We therefore need investment in care and conciliation services, and above all, in active labor policies. Finally, the last term, buffer, we mean passive policies, namely guaranteed income and all social shock absorbers. Good social cohesion policies are placed in this triangle. Even the policies against poverty would benefit from it. Sometimes it will be necessary to push more on the angle of the active policies, for example, for young people, and sometimes instead of the angle of the passive policy, because not all citizens can be activated in the same way. There are also people who cannot work. The monitoring of the outcome of citizenship income highlights the existence of a weak, fragile population, which is only to be supported economically, because there is a problem of employability. There are people and families who are not blocked by economic problems, but above all by health, education, and social problems, which are very serious, dramatic, heavy. These are situations where work is unthinkable. Finally, here is an important recommendation. To make the triangle works, it is also necessary to involve the social actors of civil society, especially trade unions, associations, and subjects of the third sector. Cohesion is achieved not only by the result of good work of the triangle, but also by the fact of involving social subjects. This is one way of encouraging cohesion and to tackle the same problems together, public and private subjects. Cohesion is not only the outcome, but also the presupposition of the social work. It is not only the output, but also the drawing of input. It is a manner of building community bonds and relationships through the local welfare system work and valuing of benefits deriving from the income provided, whether it is citizenship income or emergency income. Our aim is to create open, supportive and reflective networks capable of including everyone, starting from those in absolute poverty, from whom it must be planned a personalized project. The network will be formed by public institutions that animate the local territory, for example, municipality, social services, schools, the healthcare sector, employment centers, etc., as well as actors that belong to the third sector in dynamics of co-planning. For-profit actors can also play an important role in participation, particularly for what concerns the availability of work. The legislative provision must facilitate and promote the creation of this process. The state has an essential role in this, both because it gives a monetary contribution to citizens in difficulty and because it supports and gives structure to these welfare networks. In conclusion, the objective is to create a promotion, protection and social cohesion network.
Thank you, Rossini. So I'm going to go to Ms. Cardini again, because you were saying, of course, we were talking about the disruption of this remote learning and schooling as brought in the past year among different states. But at the same time, it's also true that digitalization has provided a crucial contribution to ensure continuity of education during the pandemic. So what are actually the opportunities provided by new technology on this respect, and what are the challenges in front of us?
Thank you for this question. Well, technology has shown a unique potential to enhance learning in this specific context. And we have also learned that there are 3 factors that are key to be able to take advantage of technology. The first one is digital infrastructure, internet access and connection. The second one is the access to devices from home, computers, mobile phones, tablets. And the third one, because if those 2 first conditions are like basic conditions, there is a third factor that deals with the digital skills that teachers, students, and families have. And from this third factor, I think that we got the biggest lesson from the pandemic, which means that digital education alone does not change education or does not necessarily teach, and students cannot necessarily learn because of digital education. And here I think that we have to move from unplanned or emergency responses to school closures that were very, very important, but have generated very different scenarios, to a more directed general direction for policy. And let me give an example of the big picture and how it has been different, the use of digital technology in the world. First of all, to remark that even high-income countries had to rely on non-digital approaches to support school lockdowns. That's the first idea that I want to put in focus. And the second is, we now have half of the world population that still lack of internet connection. So this means that this first factor, digital infrastructure, is still poor to be able to have remote learning and online learning with all students. It is now estimated that at least 1/3 of the student population around the world cannot access to online learning. And this is due to equipment, connection, and lack of online education policies. So what we are seeing is that the speed of change is extremely fast, but governments need to define the direction of this change. And I think that there we have 4 very important challenges. The first one is to ensure access to devices and connectivity. The second one is to provide digital platforms with teaching and learning resources, and to be able as government and from education policy to follow up on these tools and make them make students and teachers be able to use them. And the third one, very important, is in-service training to support teachers to adapt and to make able to use pedagogically these technologies. If we don't have a pedagogical focus on the use of technologies, they're not going to enhance teaching and learning. So these are the main challenges from my perspective.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cardini. So now to Ms. Fiaschi. Ms. Fiaschi, you were talking before about how much the non-profit sector has been important during the pandemic. So actually, I would like to ask you what lesson I will learn in view of the definition of a new welfare model, and what contribution the non-profit sector can offer, in a long term to a fair, equitable, and sustainable recovery.
La pandemia è stato un
pandemic was an important learning exercise. It put the person back in the center, the need to have a wide number of services offered and opportunity services, and that should rely on a network, community-related, social-related network, very important for people's safety and for social innovation as well. And so this actually put at play again the greater importance of proximity actions as compared to the centralized one. The fact that the location where people live should be put at the center, and also there should be actions that connected one with the other, social healthcare at different levels, national level, regional level, municipal level. And also, as far as we are concerned, it's clear that it's important to strengthen the third sector, the non-profit sector, and the cooperation between this sector and, the PA, the public administration at all levels, because for reconstruction, we have to rebuild. We need to focus on some priorities and, of course, innovate the welfare system, work, therefore, on, fight against poverty and find new, more effective and efficient way to handle, old age, and also new models of intervention. By supplementing this with technology, we'll also have to innovate the way in which we work on education and learning. This is very important because, we need to do something important here through technology in terms of learning and teaching and education. And the healthcare issue, healthcare based on a different balance between the hospital and the region, and in this respect, there is an important impact on the welfare side. The other issue concerns the economic relaunch model. We need a more sustainable economic model, more inclusive one, based on the participation of everyone and the opportunity for everyone to be able to have access to jobs. This is a key issue, a central issue. I'd like to remind you that the third sector, at least in Italy, is not just an entity that provides social support. It's also an important economic sector. 800,000 people, 2 billion in money, euro, and also we have 6 million voluntary workers. And today, for example, these are the main active work policy project, for disadvantaged people. And in this respect, we, deal with 30,000 people who are disadvantaged through, regular work. And civil service today is the main way for young people to get a job. So the people who go for civil service in Italy, and then this is a journey, pathway to find a job afterwards. So this is a very important phenomenon. And investing on the non-profit sector means also investing on the development of our region and our territory, both socially and also in economic terms, especially in the brittle areas, fragile areas. We know that we have presence everywhere, but that over the past few years, it significantly grew, especially in the more fragile areas, in the weaker communities in the south, in the periphery. And this means that we look, this is a way of looking at different development models so as to understand how this is possible and to produce common good and also, job and revenue for the community, income for the communities.
Thank you to Ms. Fiaschi, thank you to Ms. Cardini, to Professor Lebrant and to Mr. Rossini for this very interesting conversation. Now we're going to move to the next section that is going to be about, we were discussing before about the national dimension. Now we're going to discuss about the international dimension of social cohesion, what role for multilateral cooperation. And we're going to start to discuss about that with Mr. Stefano Scarpetta, who is the Director of Employment, Labor and Social Affairs at the OECD. I think he's with us. Director Scarpetta. So can you hear me? Just to make sure that you are with us. Hello.
Yes, I can.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you.
The pandemic has accelerated the deep transition ongoing in our labor market. What is the assessment of the OECD in terms of potential displacement and job losses, but also in view of the creation of new jobs?
Well, there is no question that the pandemic has indeed had a deep impact on the labor markets of just all countries. As countries took major steps to contain the spread of the pandemic, the closing schools, shops, workplaces, businesses, we have seen unemployment just in the OECD country to rose by more than 3 percentage points in 2 months last year in the spring, in between March and April. Basically, we have wiped out 10 years of progress in reducing unemployment after the global financial crisis. Then, with the partial reopening, the unemployment has declined, but even in the latest observation we have in the OECD countries, we are still 1 full percentage point above the level of before the pandemic. But I think the important point to mention is also that the crisis went way beyond, if you like, the impact on unemployment. There has been also a significant reduction in working time. Total hours have declined in the OECD countries by about 10%, which is 10 times more than what happened after the global financial crisis, as companies sort of reduce working time. Globally, I think the estimate suggests that the reduction in working time was about 8.8%, and this is equivalent of about 255 million jobs, full-time jobs. The other important point is also the impact has been very much uneven across groups. So we have seen the low-skilled young people, women, those with more precarious forms of employment being particularly affected. For example, among youth, working hours have declined by 25%, not 10% as for the overall population. And this transition has also, to some extent, accelerated the changes that were already taking place in our economies because of globalization, but also because of the digital transformation. Now, we have seen a lot of further development, including jobs being destroyed in some sectors were already affected by the transition, the digital transformation, and jobs being created even despite the difficult situation, some of the emerging sector and jobs. At the OECD, we have done a number of estimates about the risk of automation related to the digital transformation. The bottom line of our work is that we are not necessarily risking massive technological unemployment. According to our analysis, in the next 10 to 15 years in the OECD countries, we might lose some 14% of the job that would be fully automated. But at the same time, there would be about 30% of the job that would be profoundly transformed. The job will stay, but the task performed in this job will change significantly, and therefore it will be vital to equip the workers with actually the kind of skill that will be needed in order to perform these jobs. So more than massive unemployment, I would say what we're facing is significant transformation into the labor market. And certainly the pandemic has accelerated this process. So 2 major issues that I want to share with you in this context. One is how to equip workers with the skills which are needed. Just even in the OECD countries, only about 40% of workers receive regular training that will enable them to adapt their skills and competences. And when we look at the low skills, so those that potentially need the most training, this is in general is around 10–15%. The second important point, and I think the pandemic has revealed that extremely clear, we have to close the gaps in our social protection. I mean, many workers benefit from job retention scheme, the Cassa Integrazione in Italy, but those on fixed-term contract, those in the informal sector, in the emerging economies, will not benefit from these kind of schemes. So we need to close the social protection gaps and make sure we can give some form of protection to all workers, almost regardless of the type of contract they have. We have to switch from a model whereby protection is provided through the employment, to the job, to actually providing protection to the worker themselves, almost regardless of where they work. So these are some of the key challenges that to some extent the pandemic has accelerated and raised even more urgent to address.
And, you know, when we talk about important transformation in the job market, in the job world, of course, teleworking, remote working, and digital skill are going to be increasingly important element for tomorrow's actually work. Are the OECD and the G20 countries prepared to face these changes? And it is possible actually to agree on a coordinated policy support a smooth transition while preserving social cohesion?
Well, indeed, there are a number of challenges. There is no question about it. But let me start by saying that along two lines, the digital transformation has really enabled us to cope with this unprecedented, extremely severe crisis, the pandemic. Think about the fact that in less than a year, we have developed several vaccines, which seems to be quite effective in actually protecting us from the virus. Think about the fact that thanks to a digital transformation, we were able to move from 5% of workers in the OECD countries that usually work from home to actually almost 40%, 39%, in a matter of a couple of months. Without the digital technology, I think all of that would simply have been not possible. And I think while as we reopen our economies, many workers will definitely go back to work in the workplace, I think telework is going to stay, possibly to a much larger extent than what we have seen before. I think it's fair to say that telework brings a number of benefits, both to the workers and to the company. Facilitate the participation of those who might be geographically distant or for whom actually going to an office might be difficult, reduce commuting, and actually under the right condition can actually boost even productivity. But of course, at the same time, we have to address some of the key challenges. One is what I referred to before. Not everyone would actually work from home, either because the job did not allow them to do so, or because they didn't have even a basic technology, a computer, a tablet, or a broadband. So we have to make sure that we offer the opportunity for all to benefit from telework and other sort of tools that the technology allow us, because otherwise there is a risk that we are creating a further divide into the labor market between those who can use the technology and the opportunities offered by the technology and those who cannot. And again, the point is that there is already in the use of telework, in the use of digital technology, a gap between the high skill and those who have low skills. But the second point is, again, equipping everyone with digital skills. If we look at the OECD countries, you have a significant percentage of the workers who have very limited digital skills, even to perform basic tasks within the job. So there is a massive challenge going forward to skill and reskill in general, but I would say specifically to give everyone a minimum basic of digital skills. And this is challenging because, as I said before, many of those who need training and retraining actually so far have the least access, 10-15% among the low skilled. It's an issue about engaging with employers, engaging with the worker themselves, and in particular allow, for example, those working small and medium-sized enterprise to be able to step out from work and actually receive the training that they need. That's, in my view, is extremely important.
But actually, in this behalf, I mean, we should consider technology more a threat or actually an opportunity for the future of work and social cohesion?
I think that technology offers fantastic opportunities for those who have the right skill, for those who are in the right company, who say in the right location. But also, we have seen that this is not new. I think it was there certainly even before the pandemic. It is also opening some new divides, if you like. In most of the OECD countries, we have seen a sort of a polarization in the labor market, with a lot of jobs being created at the top end of the skill distribution, but also actually a number of jobs being created more towards a sort of low part of the skill distribution because our economies are aging. There is a need for more services. And the question is that there is sort of a hollowing of the middle. And in the middle, there are many workers with intermediate level of skills. So we have to enable them to actually move up into the skill ladder, again, through access to training and retraining. Of course, there is a big chapter of investing in education, but at the same time, I view there is a very important chapter of equipping workers already into the labor market with the skills which are needed. And I think the future is one in which people might switch from one job, from one occupation, from one sector to another. So we have really to some extent, reform profoundly a social protection system to become really a tool, a support that workers receive, even if they move from one job to the other, or even if they have more than one job. So both portability of social protection, access to everyone of social protection, in my view, are the key sort of tools to make sure that these opportunities are opportunities that are open to everyone, not just for those who happen to have the right skill, the right age, the right location.
Thank you very much, Director Scarpetta. So we're gonna go to Sharon Barron, who is the Secretary General for International Trade Union Confederation. I don't know if is with us.
No, good afternoon.
Okay, good afternoon. She's here with us. So, you know, we were also listening to Director Scarpetta talking about the challenges from digital of work, but in general, you know, amid this difficult situation, what are, according to you, the key challenges that workers are facing on a global level?
So globally, we have around 3 billion workers in the global labor force, but 60% of them are actually working in informal work. No rights, no minimum wage, no social protection, no rule of law. And in that context, when only 40% are in formal employment, and a third of those are actually in insecure or precarious work, we have a broken labor market. The social contract's been breaking down since the 80s with hyper-globalization, where you saw wage and condition competition basically driving down the costs through global supply chains. We need to mend this labour force. It needs a new social contract, and COVID-19 simply exposed the pre-existing crisis of historic levels of inequality and indeed the climate emergency, which means that all sectors have to transition. So we are in a situation where we can actually build for a better future, or we can try to repair what is there, which will continue to create fractures in social cohesion. For workers, what does a new social contract look like? It's the centerpiece of recovery and resilience plans. Jobs, jobs, and jobs. Secure jobs with just transition, and indeed that means they've got to be climate-friendly jobs, so resilient for the future. Rights. We need to instill the promise of the Centenary Declaration and the SDGs under all workers, irrespective of their employment arrangements. That means fundamental rights. It means occupational health and safety, so important and so exposed through the health crisis. And then, of course, we need a minimum living wage on which you can live with dignity, and we need some control over maximum hours of work, particularly with, indeed, the explosion of telework. But we also need universal social protection. And I heard the professor talk about the importance of income. Indeed, so did Stefano. At having an income at the point of unemployment or at the point of transition that you can live on again and raise your family is fundamental. And we need equality of income. That means collective bargaining, gender and race. If you don't have those, you don't have inclusion. You can't possibly meet the test of realising the SDGs, Goal 8, Goal 5, Goal 1, of course, health and education, 3 and 4, and the sustainability goals. But you can't also have a just transition model. So we need a new social contract. We need to repair a broken labour market.
But, you know, when it comes to future trends, of course, we were talking about digital transformation, but also energy, you know, climate transformation, and all these trends, they're going to impact, of course, workers. And I would like to ask you what the ITUC suggests to equip them with the appropriate tools to navigate through this process.
So every sector must transition in the climate emergency. There's just no doubt about that. If we're going to stabilise our planet, and we have just 9 years to get to around 55% of the challenge of a net zero economy, then we need to have workers at the table. Just transition is very simple. It's based on social dialogue. It's actually making sure that where there are displacements for older workers, that there are secure, livable pensions. For younger workers, it's much of what Stefano covered, which is indeed the commitment to income and income support during a transition period, which must be supported by skills development and redeployment support. And of course, we need to see that communities aren't displaced, that people have hope in communities. And that means reinvestment in communities for jobs, jobs and jobs. We need jobs plans in every nation that are climate friendly jobs. So there's no doubt that we have to face this. We have to face the digital transition, which is both an opportunity, and of course it has risks in terms of public ethics. So these are huge debates. For the union movement, we're not frightened of technology. What we cannot accept is that workers will just be stranded. People talk about no stranded assets for investors for climate. Well, we say no stranded people and no stranded communities as well.
So actually, you already maybe answered to this question, but since Italy has the presidency of the G20, I would like to go a little bit more in detail about, what is the expected for you, from your point of view, for the ITUC point of view, the expected contribution of the Labour 20, talking about the kind of issue and solution that you were just telling us before.
So the G20, I must say the Italian presidency has been very inclusive, and we appreciate that very much. There's no doubt for us that it has to be jobs, jobs and jobs, climate friendly jobs. So investment in national jobs plans with social dialogue is at the heart. If you want security, then you need to have full employment and decent work. I can tell you that this will require a global jobs target. If we're going to realise SDG 8 by 2030, you need to return to full employment. And that means 575 million jobs in the formal economy. And our target is to formalise 1 billion of the 2 billion informal jobs, so workers can have hope. But it also means a shift in the way we think about the application of rights. The Centenary Declaration guarantees, as I said, but also mandated due diligence. And our multilateral systems have to change. You can't have a WTO, for example, that continues to prop up the dehumanising exploitation of supply chains. You must have a fair competition floor of rights and indeed of environmental standards if we're to see a decent future. And universal social protection is fundamental. If we're going to ensure participation of women, of young people, of people of different races, and actually provide a labour market that generates hopes, then jobs, rights and social protection are fundamental, but so too is broader income distribution. We need to ensure as well that with the development working group and the employment working group, that there is a commitment to global solidarity to build those social protection systems in the poorest countries. It possibly shocks your viewers to understand that in a crisis like this, 73% of people could rely on little or no social protection at a time of their worst levels of anxiety for just survival. We need health and income at the core of social protection for everybody. I'm confident that the G20 will deal with the big challenges. The question is, will there be the political will to be brave enough to actually put workers, their jobs, their rights and their social protection at the heart of recovery and resilience and really build forward in a better way.
We're going to discover that in the next months, of course, when, you know, the labor discussion on the G20 level is going to be more in detail. Thank you, Secretary Barrow, for this important, you know, reflection that we have done together about the situation of job market. But talking about G20, I'm very pleased to actually welcome also the Minister of Finance of Angola, Vera Esperança dos Santos Daves de Souza. And, you know, I really would like to ask her what actually African country, what they're asking to the G20 and which proposal, of course, can they offer to fight inequalities and promote social cohesion, particularly through women and youth empowerment. Minister.
Thank you. The African countries are asking for us to pursue a more balanced world regarding the access to liquidity, regarding the access to vaccines, regarding the access to health, education. We understand that we can fill the gap in between the access to these important drivers of development. We are aware that we keep doing or keep moving forward regarding our own responsibilities to implement reforms in our countries, but we also believe that in partnership with our G20 with the G20 group and the European and American and Asian countries, we can move ourselves on even faster. So multilateral institutions, development banks, development agency, international organizations would be key partners regarding the two main pillars that we were discussing during the summit. One is to allow the African countries to have access to concessional financing funds. And the second one is to establish the proper environment, business environment, to develop the private sector, especially to take advantage of the demographic dividend of Africa, especially within youth and women. We have a lot of potential within the youth, and we need to provide or to promote capacity building and also put in place mechanisms that provide access to financing to that youth, and also knowledge to make sure that they contribute more for the growth of the African countries, for our development, and with this to increase the social conditions of the people of Africa.
Thank you, Minister. You cannot be longer with us, so we're going to move to the final panel discussion. Actually, the three guests, I think they are all connected with us. We're going to discuss with Arjun Jayadev, which is Professor of Economics at the Azim Premji University of Bangalore, and then Simone Cecchini, who is Senior Social Affairs Official for the Social Development Division at ACLAC, and Mtunsi Mdwaba, who is the Vice Chairman of the International Labour Organization. I'm going to start with Professor Jayadev. You know, according to the World Bank, Professor, in 2020, as a consequence of COVID-19, there were more than 120 million new poor globally. What does it mean for social cohesion? especially for actually developing economies and emerging markets like India, which are already more exposed to financial vulnerabilities?
Thanks for having me. The numbers that you quoted are Pew figures based on World Bank poverty lines, but in fact, unfortunately, those figures are too optimistic. Some of my colleagues who've been working in India on a project called the State of Working India suggest that really if you take something like the national minimum wage, which is a very reasonable category to say a poverty line, in fact, in India alone, there's about 230 million more poor, right? So in some sense, I think that we completely underestimate in developing countries how incredibly devastating COVID has been in terms of really the very basic things like poverty reduction, which we've seen gains over the last 20 years. Many of them have been, in some sense, wiped out. Now, it's maybe a particularly Indian phenomenon because of the strong lockdown we had last year. But I think across the world, what we're seeing, in fact, is that people are trapped in poverty because of the lack of employment opportunities, because of lack of income support. They're increased in indebtedness, and their earnings remain depressed. So in that sense, the news is extremely bad, and also we're seeing huge dislocations in the labor market itself. People who finally came into the formal labor force and had some sort of formal protections are now becoming informalized, or worse, as is the case with women in India, just leaving the labor force. So when one asks, for example, social cohesion, what can one say? It is devastating for any kind of view of an inclusive growth process where we're trying to encourage many people to get into gainful employment and to actually see their welfare rise. And of course, financial vulnerabilities have risen manyfold as a result of that. In addition, maybe just one ought to underline that this thing isn't going away. And right now in India, as you know, we're in the second wave, which is quite devastating. So there are the very simple, and awful thoughts of just basic mortality, what it's going to do to, many people's indebtedness, their ability to earn incomes, because this is not limited in India, for example, only to let's say the relatively elderly, but across the population distribution as well. So I think we're just at the beginning of trying to, of seeing what it will do for social cohesion or destruction, more likely. I think we had a mild wave last year, and what we're going to see this year as a result, we have yet to see, but it will be bad.
Thank you, Professor. So now from India to Latin America, because Mr. Cecchini is the Officer for the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean. And, as a result of the 2020 crisis, a number of Latin American countries suffer from financial defaults and investment outflows, actually even before maybe the 2020 crisis. What have been the consequences on poverty and inequality in the region? And could we say that Latin America missed another opportunity to fight its long-lasting weakness?
Thanks a lot, Giovanna, for the question. Well, Latin America has been very heavily hit by the pandemic. We just have about 8% of the world population, but we had 19% of contagions and 28% of the world's deaths because of coronavirus. Now, I think that the poverty rise during 2020, more than to defaults, which happened in a few cases, in a few countries, or financial outflows, is connected to the fact that the pandemic arrived in a region that has huge structural problems of inequality, informality, and lack of social protection. 54% of workers in the region are informal, they lack social protection, and they have been very heavily hit by lockdowns. And as you were saying, even before the pandemic in Latin America, poverty was increasing, inequality was high, and public discontent was growing. Then in 2020, we had the worst economic crisis in Latin American history, minus 7.1% of GDP. And these affected very large sectors of the population. Many are vulnerable in the region. 8 out of 10 Latin Americans live with incomes just up to 3 times the poverty line. In our social panorama of Latin America, we show that poverty rose from 33.3% in 2019 to 33.7% in 2020. 1 out of 3 Latin Americans are now poor, and the poverty reduction progress was set back by about 12 years. Obviously, these are averages. There are countries like Uruguay that have only 5% of the population in poverty, and countries in Central America like Guatemala, Honduras, or Nicaragua with 10 times that rate. Now, the rise in poverty would have been much worse if it were not for hundreds of emergency social protection measures which were adopted by Latin American governments, be it cash transfers or in-kind transfers, and they reached about 60% of the population in dollars, 1.5% of GDP. And without those measures, poverty would have been 3.5% higher. Now, income inequality also, as the informal sector was heavily hit and those with low incomes were heavily hit, income inequality is forecast to go up. We estimate a rise in the Gini coefficient of about 2.9%, and without the emergency measures, it would have been even worse, 5.6%. I don't think that necessarily this was a missed opportunity. We can now rethink social protection systems and the welfare state in Latin America. These emergency measures were innovative in a way because they included informal workers, which are traditionally excluded from both the contributory and the non-contributory measures for the poorest. But obviously, this is just a first step. Countries will have to continue to make progress to build rights-based, comprehensive, universal social protection systems that are financially sustainable. But I think that policy space in the region has opened up, and there is an important role for the state to fight poverty and inequality.
Thank you, Mr. Cecchini. Now we're going to Africa with Vice President, Vice Chairman Mduaba. I hope that I pronounced it correctly. I wanted to ask you, Africa is a region which is always characterized by huge economic and social potential, still largely unexploited, unfortunately. What are the key challenges for the continent in terms of inequality, and what progress actually has been made?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, Giovanni, for you and your colleagues inviting me to join you. And also, I must just start by also congratulating the G20 Italy and the B20 Italy for really doing a great job, having attended almost all of the G20s since the beginning. So, to reduce inequality, Giovanni, we must understand its causes and consequences, which can be complex and deeply rooted in social, economic, political and environmental systems and resources. I think, listening to all the colleagues, I think, we can all agree on the challenges. I think the real thing that we need to agree on is how do we move forward? Because whether they came through the COVID or they came pre-existing, because we all agree as well that these have existed for a long, long time. We've just ignored them and now they've been exposed. Income inequalities need to be tackled through more inclusive growth, I think, firstly, which requires increased employment opportunities for all. So when Sharon was talking about jobs, absolutely, jobs. Without jobs, we have a problem. And to do this, we need to support productivity gains and have economic growth, but also need to create a sense of dignity and control over people's own destiny. Achieving value for money and accountability in service delivery by fighting corruption, lots of corruption that we have that we need to deal with, and promoting voice in decision-making and more inclusion and social cohesion by promoting safety nets and other risk protection mechanisms. I think we've already heard from some of the colleagues about these. Now, in my continent, evidence shows that investing in education, health, and economic opportunities is absolutely fundamental to realizing the continent's human capital potential and sparing sustainable economic growth. Human capital, of course, is a broad concept which identifies human characteristics which can be acquired and which increase income. It is commonly taken to include people's knowledge and skills acquired partly through education, but can also include their strength and vitality, which are dependent on their health and nutrition. Health and education are both components of human capital and contributors to human welfare. This can never be underestimated. This is absolutely, absolutely critical. The level of education is a key factor in unlocking Africa's potential. People who have completed secondary and tertiary education are less likely to be in informal employment compared to workers who have either no education or completed primary education. Our region faces what seems to be its indelible problem, informality. Now, all the colleagues have talked about informality. And I think for me, if we could just look at this very differently, we should not miss sight of the major remedy for Africa's informality, working poverty and unemployment problems. Productivity growth partnered with an innovative and creative array of tools to address this informality. Because, you know, we can't simply, as we've done for a very long time, talk about transitioning people from informality to formality. I'm sorry, for me, that cannot be the silver bullet. That's very reductionist. We need to find a way where we have a very wide array of innovative and creative tools for how to tackle this. I mean, you had Sharon talking about 60% of the world's workers are in informality. We had the professor in India talking about how big it is as well in India. We had Simone talking about Latin America as well. I mean, all of us are talking about this. This for me is the elephant in the room. It's the elephant in the room that I think we've been approaching in a very flawed manner. So as we move forward and investing in human capital, knowing that it's key to reducing inequalities in Africa, we need to find this innovative ways of doing things differently. Human capital affects economic growth. We all know this, and can help to develop an economy by expanding the knowledge and skills of its people. The skills provide, of course, economic value, since a knowledgeable workforce can lead to increased productivity. Productivity differentials explain the difference in levels of development and living conditions that we observe among and within countries and the regions we're in. Over the past decade, African governments and donor institutions have been making a concerted push to significantly increase primary school enrollment rates with some success. My own university, that I'm a professor of law at the University of Western Cape, which is not far from the University of Cape Town, that's also featured here today, we place a lot of emphasis in the relevance of the education and the relevance of the tools and the technology we provide, that it provides for its communities. We also need to be very community-centered in our approach. This is an important first step. Although Africa has experienced an increase in education and literacy rates, the quality of the education itself remains below par. Sub-Saharan Africa is, for example, the lowest literacy rate of any world region. And similarly, 84% of children and adolescents have not achieved the minimum proficiency for mathematics. And as a context, as I close, Giovanni, the global average for this is 56%, which is completely abysmal. To address the skills gap program and produce a versatile, productive, inclusive, and adaptable workforce, the region must make essential investments in foundational, cognitive, and socio-emotional skills at the early childhood development stage. So that would be my take on the question you've posed, Giovanni. Thank you very much.
So Professor Jayadev, Vice Chairman Nwaba was talking about the need for innovative tools. And I would like to ask you, when it comes to emerging and developing economy in countries, what policy instrument should actually be put in place to effectively fight poverty and inequality, targeting in particular women and young people?
Yeah, so, thanks. I think every country has its own particular social protection programs and an architecture which differs, country to country, and some are more effective, some are less effective. So maybe I should just speak about what I think, is quite essential, let's say in the Indian context. And I'm sure that many of these things actually apply, across emerging markets as a whole, emerging economies as a whole. And I'd like to kind of identify three different levels, if you will, of response. One is really immediate responses, and then what you might call medium-term responses, and then that kind of longer-term strategies, which my colleague from South Africa was referring to. So let me maybe begin with, what I say is the immediate concerns. We're now, where I'm staying right now in Bangalore, we're in a lockdown, and really across the country we have various levels of lockdown going on. And we saw last year these horrific images of migrant workers, walking hundreds of kilometers going back because very simply food was not available. So we need to be able to provide, and actually we have seen this happen, things like universal free rations, the public distribution system allowing for something very simple like that until the pandemic is brought under control. Cash transfers where possible. We have in India a particular thing called the Jan Dhan account. So cash transfer where possible, so to allow for families which have been this badly hit, as I mentioned, 230 million new poor, to have actually sources of income. And then in addition to that, once we start to talk about coming out of the pandemic, the immediate concerns about the pandemic, moving to actually trying to provide employment opportunities. India, as you know, has an employment guarantee scheme, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. We need to expand the capacity of that act. Clearly, the private sector is not going to be able to get on its feet very soon and start employing the number of people who've exited the labor market, as we spoke about. But certainly, as the Rural Employment Guarantee Act can expand the number of days that it will provide employment as an entitlement. And we also ought to be thinking of urban employment guarantee schemes. Again, there's a lot of work that's been done recently about that. Automatic enrollment in particular places. So there's a whole set of activities that you can do in the medium term. Also, in order really to combat the pandemic, frontline workers need to be given emergency, hardship allowances. They're actually finding it extremely hard. So as a whole, there's a whole set of social expenditures that one ought to take really for relief and sort of short-term to medium-term protection. Now, in the medium to long term, obviously, one of the problems that we've seen across the world is sort of the failure of our systems to be able to generate effective employment. So let's not call it formal or informal, but let's say just employment which is reliable, which can ensure that people are not thrown back into poverty regularly. We've not been able to do that, and some models have worked for some time. So clearly the East Asian model, we don't know how viable that's going to be in the future. The Indian model was based roughly on construction and finance, as really being the key drivers, and some sort of high-end consumption. That model seems to have run out. So we really do need a more thoughtful model of how we're going to actually see employment gains. And I think, when people speak about productivity, I do want to suggest that one thing that we are not thinking about is all the kind of sectors that we really need human labor. Broadly, I would say education and health are the obvious ones, but there's a whole set of places where we still have not figured out how to work without human beings. And really, we ought to be able to support those very, very critical industries in the medium to long term. And I think as a combination of packages, as I said, the relief packages, of which there are many different sorts, the medium-term packages, which are really kind of holding the fort as we think through these our new sorts of models, and then finally our long-term packages, which are thinking about different forms of employment, all the while, as the previous speaker spoke about, thinking carefully about what this means for climate change and all the other challenges we have going forward.
Thank you, Professor. Now, talking about tools and possible solution, we're going to go to Cecchini because, of course, in your recent report for the European Commission for the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, you state very clearly that the cost of inequality in your region have become unsustainable and that it is necessary to build back with fairness and sustainability. So what policy are mostly needed to leave structural flaws behind?
Yes, indeed. In Latin America, to address the structural flaws of the region, we need these a kind of policy responses which promote a transformative recovery with equality and sustainability. And first and foremost, we need to build a welfare state which has these universal, comprehensive and sustainable social protection and care systems. Universal to include all the citizens, the informal sector, those large sectors of society which are either poor or vulnerable. Comprehensive because Latin American social protection systems are very fragmented between private pension or health systems, public systems for formal workers or specific sectors like the military, and then low quality public systems for the poor. And sustainable, not just in financial terms, but also in terms of enjoying the broad support of the population, because this does not happen when the benefits are insufficient or are extremely targeted or only for a few lucky ones. You know, Latin America is a middle income region, but there are huge inequalities, and these inequalities are not just unfair, but they are inefficient, right? Thus, we need to invest, for instance, in quality public education. We need to avoid losses of human capacities. Many children and youth do not learn much in school, and also at least 1 in 3 of our youth does not complete secondary education. Also, we need to invest in care systems with the support of the state, and this would help address gender inequalities, especially inequalities related to the non-remunerated work done in the home. Women in Latin America have better educational indicators than men, but then when they get to the labor market, they do worse. They're more represented in the informal sector, they have higher unemployment rates, and they have lower labor incomes. And during the pandemic, there was a huge outflow from the labor market on the part of women. And thus, care systems are key. And social protection and care systems are not just expenditures, they are a real investment into a more productive economy. Obviously, to reach that, we need new social compacts, which are based on broad and participatory dialogue. And I think that the pandemic has opened up space for such compacts. Citizens, even before the pandemic, they were demanding more universalistic social protection measures. We can see it, for instance, here in Chile, where there is now a process for a new constitution, where the debate has opened up to realize the economic, social, and cultural rights of the population. Obviously, Chile is in a better position than many other Latin American countries because it has possibilities to get in debt at reasonable rates. It is benefiting from high copper prices, but still fiscal space can be built. We can reduce tax evasion, tax elusion, we can make tax systems more progressive, and we can introduce wealth taxes. And finally, mentioning that building the welfare state also has to go together with the transformation of production, with technological change, with capacity building, because this is still a region that depends so much from the export of raw materials. At the ECLAC, for instance, we have identified the sectors for this kind of transformation: the care economy, the digital economy, circular economy, bioeconomy, and renewable energies. Thanks.
Thank you, Cecchini. Going back to Vice Chairman and Vice President Dwaba, you were saying also before, quoting Barrow for the International Trade Union Organization, that jobs are the key to unlock strong and continued economic growth. How can this condition be met, especially when it comes to African companies?
Well, I was disconnected for a little while, Giovanni. I hope I missed nothing, but I think it's part of these growing inequalities of our time. But I think for me, I want to reiterate, without jobs, we have problems. With continued poverty, we have huge problem. And so first, it is impossible to talk about a brighter future for Africa without putting the promotion of an enabling business environment for propelling productivity growth and skills development at the center of our policies, regulations, and institutions. The centenary declarations that Sharon was talking about, I led my group as part of the social dialogue tripartism in the centenary celebration of the ILO in 2019 to conclude that centenary declaration. So absolutely agree. Any action or inaction that makes the business environment unfavorable to the development of the private sector, or drags productivity growth, or slows down skills development, or widens skills mismatches is antithetical to a better future for Africa. This is absolutely important. Labor market conditions in Africa and elsewhere are likely to be influenced by two phenomena: increasing globalization and the rise of new technology. One form of globalization is the increase in the share of international trade from developing countries. The rise of new technology is most visible in the case of information technology, and such technology is likely to induce a shift in demand from unskilled to skilled labor. This will raise the return to acquiring higher levels of human capital and may help to explain why the return to post-primary education is still sizable despite large increases in supply. However, other technologies may also be important for Africa. For example, agriculture on the continent has yet to benefit from anything comparable to the Asian Green Revolution, as it was called. Studies of agricultural productivity in developing countries tend to find substantial returns to education in modernizing environments where there are new technologies to adopt, but virtually no returns in traditional environments. Furthermore, sustainable social protection systems, which everybody has talked about this afternoon, which guarantee a minimum living income for the needy, are an important pillar of socioeconomic systems which contribute to reducing poverty and preventing social exclusion. Sharon mentioned a figure of 73%, for example, when she was talking, who need that just to survive. With ILO recommendation 202, there is a global tripartite consensus on the development of social protection floors, which needs to be vigorously implemented according to national realities. Has to be according to national realities, as the Prof was saying in India earlier as well. Social protection systems need to be sustainably financed, need to go hand in hand with policies, need to address the plight of a significant number of workers in the informal sector, and to respond to the specific needs and be coherent with the socioeconomic traditions of the respective countries in question. Finding innovative ways, as I said earlier, that are based on incentives to ensure the participation of all stakeholders in the building economies and the developing sustainable social protection systems is absolutely key. So to end, I would like to insist again on the fact that we must put productivity at the same time as we put people at the center. We must put productivity at the heart of everything we do in Africa. Without productivity, the future for me, as far as I'm concerned, is doomed. Africa's population, hence consumption, is increasing in leaps and bounds in the face of limited and exhaustible natural resources, such as land, water, and minerals. Unless we are able to produce more with fewer inputs through promoting an enabling business environment that encourages technological applications and product and process innovation, we will not only lack the means to provide the basic necessities of life to our population, but also inevitably find ourselves facing very, very insurmountable and irreversible economic, social, and natural cataclysmic. And I end there, Giovanni.
So thank you, gentlemen. You were very good when it comes to timing. So we have the time for a question coming from the audience for Professor Jayadev. I'm going to read it for you. The global fight on inequalities has produced positive results over the last decades. However, in view of the UN 2030 agenda, is this enough? What more could be done in terms of multilateral efforts?
Well, thanks. I won't take too long on this. It's never enough. There's always things that one could do more. I would say a couple of things. I think one of the things that the pandemic has identified is that we are not very good at working with global public goods. We have this whole question of vaccine inequality. We have the whole question of extremely diverse responses to innovation, and the inability, if you will, of the system overall to provide equally across the world when we talk about global inequality. So I think, for example, very, very centrally, we need to rethink our mechanisms of innovations, our mechanisms of sharing knowledge in a way that will actually allow for much more widespread innovation and much more widespread knowledge production, and that really moves the heart of challenging the overall IP regimes we have globally. That, I would say, has really come to a head and become extremely clear in this particular pandemic. But broadly, thinking about global health as a global public good, talking about climate change is a global public good. Once we start to see ourselves as really requiring enormous amounts of effort to produce a global public good, knowing that the private sector can't do it, we will come up with hopefully better responses.
Thank you. And now for Simone Cecchini, another question that comes to us. How does the ECLAC work with other multilateral institutions? Is there room for effective cooperation to address common challenges?
Well, the ECLAC is part of the United Nations, so let's say that multilateral cooperation is in our DNA. For instance, we have these intergovernmental bodies, such as the Regional Conference on Social Development, where we put together government officials, civil society, international organization, and we exchange experiences, discuss policy options, and very importantly, we succeed committing countries to regional agendas, such as the Regional Agenda on Inclusive Social Development, to foster these ideas of universal social protection and comprehensive care systems. But a point I would like to make is that indeed, over the years, around the issue of inequality, it seems that we are getting to a consensus. Now, ECLAC has talked about inequality for decades. Now, after the 2008-2009 crisis, and now with the pandemic, we see different organizations, IFIs, the International Monetary Fund, also talking about inequality. So I think that on the discourse, we're getting there, and now we really need to get into action and to provide citizens real results to see that we are going to build fairer and more equal societies. Otherwise, we're going to have a big backlash. Thanks.
Thank you. For Vice Chairman Mdwaba and also Vice Presidents, they were asking about your organization, that it's, of course, the International Organization for Employers that highlight the recent, let's say, Free Trade African Agreement, the African CFTA trade agreement, as an opportunity to create jobs in the whole continent. How to make sure that economic growth is matched by fairness and sustainability?
Well, having a single continental market for goods and services with free movement of business persons and investments through the African continental free trade area is a targeted policy, which is really what we need, that will attract investments to job-rich areas and accelerate the establishment of a conducive environment for enterprise and job creation, as well as harmonized regional integration across the continent. This is particularly important in view of the desperate situation of many people who've been impacted by the employment crisis due to COVID-19 and other pre-existing situations. In order to address poverty and enable people to fulfill their aspirations, we need a vibrant private sector. I mentioned this earlier on. We need to be sustainable. The African continental free trade area will play a crucial role in mitigating the socio-economic crisis we're experiencing at the moment. But the trick, of course, is in implementation. And however, in order to fully harness the opportunities the African Continental Free Trade Area offers, we must address some of the root causes in relation to the main challenges we face. And just let me name here 3. Surprise, surprise, informality, I've mentioned before, and lacking or uncertain property rights, corruption and weak governance, and insufficient access to essential services. On any of these topics, I could speak forever, could speak for hours. But just to focus for one moment on property rights, it is particularly women entrepreneurs in my continent who suffer because of lacking rights for women. Some parts of my continent, women may not own land, for example. Getting this straight and fully empowering women as entrepreneurs and or farmers will not only reboot the economy and the job market, but is also the basis for enabling women to get ahead in life and fulfill their talents. So at the end of the day, any trade agreement, as I said earlier, is only as good as its implementation. It is important to put this into perspective, the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, which will inform the policy pathways to manage uncertainties around the agreement. The expectations of an enhanced intra-Africa trade are being hampered by challenges such as border closure, travel bans, nationalism, and uncertainty in tariffs and exchange rates. The opening up of free trade areas offers youth and women greater opportunity to be principal players in regional value chains. With the digital economy and e-commerce growing at a rapid rate, the youth and women will benefit immensely by leveraging on Africa's digital infrastructure to maximize existing opportunities through the AFCFTA. I mean, again, the Minister of Angola covered some of these and what is needed to make these things happen. Capital constraint, which has been a major challenge for youth and women-led startups and enterprises in Africa, may become an issue of the past if new innovative solutions of providing credit for e-commerce, including fintech solutions, can be adopted by the youth within the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. This can be realized through cross-border crowdfunding initiatives, for example, to fund youth and women-led e-commerce. Africa, it needs to be stressed, unlike Europe, Asia and the Americas, has been lagging behind in nurturing youth talent. And the youth, as we heard again from the minister in Angola, is in the majority. So we are unable to leverage and take advantage of this demographic advantage we have unless we fix these things. The successful implementation of this single market, which allows for free movement of persons, offers youth and women an opportunity to explore their potential fully and ply their trade anywhere on the continent. And to end, a fair and sustainable implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement will require the combined commitment and effort of all African social partners and stakeholders and an effective social dialogue. Again, it aligns with what Sharon Barrows had said earlier about social dialogue also being at the center of what we do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vice President Bwaba. Thank you to all of you gentlemen. So you gave us a lot of food for thoughts on this international panel. So now we are moving to the conclusion of our discussion, and Professor Tito Boeri just joined me here in the studio. Welcome and good afternoon. Professor Boeri is, of course, Professor of Economics at Bocconi, but is also the lead co-chair of the T20 and the TF6 on social cohesion and the future of welfare system. So in this role, I would like to ask you if you can please tell us what are the most urgent challenges that you're focusing on, especially what contribution will you intend to offer to Italy's presidency of the G20?
Well, thank you, first of all, for this opportunity. I think that many speakers before me have been underlining the fact that the pandemic has increased inequalities worldwide and also increased the number of very poor, of the absolute poor, those living below the poverty line. According to estimates of the World Bank, there are today some more than 100 million people in absolute poverty, more than before the pandemic. And we are going back in terms of the poverty reduction plans to 5 years ago. So all the plans have been postponed by some 5 years. So clearly the priority should be trying to reduce poverty. And here, innovation has been made, as also we were just listening from my colleagues in other parts of the world, in particular by reaching the informal sector workers, by reaching also, I would stress, workers in small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as the self-employed, because these are typically categories that were not sufficiently reached by safety nets that were built before the pandemic. So that should go on, and we cannot stop doing that. And we also should try and create some real safety nets for the developing countries, where clearly poverty has been increasing the most, and clearly our concern are very much, we're just talking about African countries. In this respect. And here, cross-country coordination is important because there is a need for an assistance that can only be organized at the cooperation level, at the G20 level. I would say that for the Italian presidency, it's very important to stress this feature of cross-country coordination. This is what indeed should be done. And the cross-country coordination should be reached in various dimensions. One is clearly, as I was saying, providing assistance to developing countries. Another one is in trying to fund these schemes, not taxing only labor incomes, because we really have to create more employment this time. So we want to tax other sources of income, such as capital taxation. There should be more cooperation worldwide in taxing large corporations. One of the proposals that has been put forward by our task force is indeed the one of introducing a new wealth tax on large corporations. That could indeed fund a safety net in developing nations. Also, given that there is a lot of experimentation going on worldwide, countries have been innovating welfare systems, it's very important that the G20 becomes also a place where all of these experiences are shared and we learn from failures and successes in reaching the people in need. And here there is scope, and let me say that because I represent here also the research institutions, that it is extremely important that all governments build a very strict relationship with research worldwide. During the pandemic, sure, government have been interacting a lot with health experts, epidemiologists, and so on. But there are also the social scientists that have been very much investing time, energies, intellectual capacity in developing and devising also tools and proposals that are really also grounded, are things that are feasible. And so government should, I think, develop a stricter link with the research institutions. And clearly the G20 can be such a place because, there is also this parallel organization of T20 institution that is there, and we are ready to help out as much as we can.
Absolutely. Also because maybe it's a special moment in the world. We also talk about what recently happened in the US when it comes to corporate taxation, what recently happened in the EU. So maybe there is a positive flow in this behalf that can bring also this kind of, new tools at a global level, because the solution, as we were saying at the beginning, must be global, isn't it?
Absolutely. No, I think there is more awareness of the fact that there should be more cross-country coordination. The pandemic is a clear case where there was such a need, and the vaccination campaign is another area. And certainly taxation of large corporations is a key area. It's difficult to see immediately the feasibility of a proposal such as the one of introducing a minimum tax on large corporations. Because it is sufficient that just a single country abandon the agreement and everything clearly doesn't work any longer. But I think there is still a lot of things that can be done, and we can build on this new awareness that is on both sides of the Atlantic right now. First of all, at the European level, it's very important that an agreement is made in making it possible to make decisions about fiscal policies with a qualified majority, so without having to go through the unanimity rule. And secondly, I think it's very important that in all countries a very careful consideration is made of all the various ways in which large corporations can avoid paying taxes or can evade taxation. So I think a very careful exam of all the provisions that have been introduced over time in this sense. So this is a matter of national policies, but coordinated could be a way to deal with that. And finally, as I was saying, thinking about new global taxes, such as this one, that is easy to enforce because it is on stock market capitalization of a large corporation headquartered in G20 countries, and I think it has the probability to raise some funds that could be possibly used to support safety net in developing nations.
Yeah, maybe the pandemic in this behalf could represent an opportunity more, than a negative aspect. We always need to look also at the bright side, and the Italian presidency of the G20 in this particular moment could maybe bring to very important reform that were for such a long time postponed. So we were supposed to be joined also by the Italian Ministry for Labour, Andrea Orlando, but unfortunately he's still in the press conference with our Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, because they are presenting our new measures to help actually business and economy and the labour market. So unfortunately he couldn't join us because this appointment came before us, that's for sure. But I would like to thank all of you for having been with us in these 3 hours. Thanks to Professor Boerde, of course, and we hope that this conversation was interesting for you. And of course, don't forget the next appointment with the Forum of the T20. There's going to be on June 9 about digital transition and agenda. Thank you to all of you. Good afternoon.